Hello and welcome to the webinar, How Can DHS Help Protect My Election? Today's presentation is part of a series of webinars brought to you by the Certificate in Election Administration program here at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. My name is Lee Chittenden. I am the Administrative Director of the Certificate program, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping items to go over. First, we are recording the webinar and we'll be sending out a link to the recording and slides once we are finished. So you can look for that in your inbox. And secondly, during the presentation, we will have 2 Q&A sessions where you'll be able to submit questions to the panelists. In order to ask a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar screen, highlighted here by the red circle. This will open a Q&A dialog box where you can type and submit your question. We will be monitoring questions and we'll get through as many as we can. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Our main presenter today is Noah Praetz. Noah is an election consultant advising the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Formerly, he ran elections in Cook County, Illinois, where he was responsible for the overall management of elections in one of the largest election jurisdictions in the country. Noah is also an adjunct professor at DePaul University College of Law, teaching election law, and is on the advisory board of the University of Chicago Cyber Policy Institute. He has presented on election security, sustainability, election day management, voter registration modernization, and other election-related items. And moderating the webinar today is Judd Choate. Judd is the Director of Elections for the Colorado Department of State. He was the president of the National Association of State Election Directors in 2017. He has a JD from the University of Colorado Law School and a PhD in political science from Purdue University. Judd is also a faculty and steering committee member for the Certificate in Election Administration program here at the Humphrey School. And now I will turn it over to Judd to frame up Noah's presentation.
Hey, thanks, Lee. So through the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute Election Security webinar series, this is part 3. We have, you might remember we had myself and Matt Masterson. We did sort of that how does physical security and cybersecurity work together webinar back in the summer. And then most recently we had the EI-SCC here with Ben Spear and Kateri Gill talking about their offerings and how they can help jurisdictions to protect their elections. And now we've got Noah today. We aim to help state and local elections officials better understand what to focus on, how to prioritize, and where to find partners to help you secure your elections. We all benefit when we work with experts, and in this case, we're talking about the GCC, DHS, EI-SCC, and all the information and expertise that comes from them. Protecting democracy, of course, means protecting elections. You all face daily attacks from the bad guys, and the most capable, best protected jurisdictions have specific plans and partnerships for addressing those threats. And the fact that you're here joining us today means that you are on that list. We need to share information, establish best practices, coordinate response plans to help to mitigate these attacks and risks, be they coordinated or otherwise. And today you're going to hear from one of the nation's top experts on election security, and better than that, he grew up an elections official. Noah Praetz was the longtime elections director in Cook County, Illinois, and recently joined the Department of Homeland Security to lead the CISA's outreach on election security. He travels all around the country, meeting with large jurisdictions and small to discuss with each of us how we can use the programs and systems that are offered by the Department of Homeland Security to protect our elections. Noah pretty much lives and breathes elections and election security. We first worked together on the executive committee for the Governmental Coordinating Council after Secretary Jay Johnson declared elections to be critical infrastructure in 2017. Without Noah, the GCC wouldn't have made many of the extraordinary gains that it made in 2017 and 2018. It's not an overstatement to say that he's a total rock star in election security. You might remember that I proclaimed Matt Masterson to be the Mick Jagger of election security. I can go one step further and tell you that Noah's the Keith Richards, and we all know the status of Mick Jagger compared to Keith Richards. So with that, let me hand it over to our expert, Noah, and you can take it over.
All right, Judd. Well, that was super generous of you, and thanks, Lee, for having us here. It's nice to be in studio on the campus of the University of Minnesota. Got a great Gopher welcome this morning, so a nice place to be. So as Judd laid out, I do consult with CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And our top priority is to support election officials as we adjust our processes, policies, procedures to the new environment that we're in. As I think about this, coming from Cook County, where I ran elections for 20 years, we were the epicenter of the sort of modern era in elections. 2016, there were attacks on voter confidence and election infrastructure on two fronts. There's an information front and an infrastructure front. The State Board of Elections attack in Illinois brought forth a modern era where election officials now have to become cybersecurity managers. Now, that doesn't mean that all of you will become experts in cybersecurity, but it does mean that part of your playbook now is to understand the cybersecurity risks and then to be able to hold your vendors and your security consultants accountable by knowing the right questions to ask. And so DHS comes in, I think, successfully as a partner to help you understand those risks, to help you mature your planning and position you to take care of yourselves. You know, we're not positioned to put our hands on your keyboards to secure and control your networks. That remains your job, but we're here to partner with you. So I want to dig in on that a little bit today. You know, as I think about what we're facing, as I said, two fronts. We've also got a major information or disinformation front. And in 2016, that was probably the most disruptive set of attacks on our democracy, really getting to the heart of trust in our institutions. If there are two virtues in elections, they're truth and trust. By protecting the infrastructure, the vote counting, the voter registration systems, we can protect truth. But trust, we've got to also be working on the information side of things. So let me advance this slide here if I can figure out how. So our 2020 initiative really focuses on 4 pillars. Most important is to support state and local election authorities. And we've spent 2 years building relationships at the state level after a rocky rollout in 2017, and I think we've come a very long way. But as we study the issue, it's clear, I think, at the federal, state, and certainly at the local level, that most of the risks are borne by local election officials. And so we've redoubled our efforts to provide outreach and services at the local level. I'll detail a few of those later and certainly welcome any of your engagement on those services. You can just send me an email and I'll start the engagement off. It's also important to recognize, though, with 8,800 local election officials, that that's a tremendous number of touch points. But if you zoom out a little bit, all 8,800 are relying on a finite number of election technology providers. You know, 5 probably primarily in the voting system side of things, more when it comes to voter registration and poll books. But by partnering deeply with the election vendor community, they're able to mature to some degree the security of their systems, and local election officials become downstream beneficiaries of that. It's also important to recognize that we're working in a giant ecosystem where attacks on campaigns or political candidates get conflated as election attacks or election hacks. And so it's important to support the election campaigns and political infrastructure. And so we're willing and partnering with presidential campaigns and others at the federal level to help ensure that their political campaign infrastructure is protected from the adversaries who are just as likely to want to get inside of those systems as they are inside of election officials. And then finally, and probably most difficult, is to start to prep the public for, not only what happened in 2016 or 2018, but what's coming. I think what's obvious and clear is that misinformation and disinformation campaigns are very easy for our adversaries. They're low cost. They're working with an American public that's already predisposed to be divided, to rely on alternate facts. And so, getting inside of our media, inside of our social media networks and dividing us along political fault lines is easy and low cost. And some of our efforts are aimed at sort of training Americans how to recognize when that's happening. So, just a moment, we're partner with a number of different think tanks, obviously here, also the Belfer Center at Harvard. The entire federal government is in on this, but then we partner directly with the media and the tech companies, and then also with cybersecurity and threat assessment firms. And a number of goals there is, to bring better information to election officials and campaigns and the public, to raise awareness, and then to improve our ability to sort of warn election officials and respond should that become necessary. So I led into this a little bit already, but top goal is to increase engagement and support to local election officials. But also, we'd like to raise awareness regarding the need for regular investment in election infrastructure. And that's true at the federal level, but also at the state and the local level. And so we'll go out to places like the National Conference of State Legislatures and talk about places where, by states investing in their election infrastructure, they can buy down risk. I even got the opportunity to come here to Minnesota and speak before a House and legislative joint meeting, as Minnesota was trying to release the HAVA funds that were issued by the federal government last year. We're also working to continue to increase our understanding about risk so that we're sure to be focusing our services and products in the right place. So we've got one service called a risk and vulnerability assessment, and that's a really deep dive. We'll send 6 people out to sort of good guy hackers probe around networks. In Cook County, we had DHS come in and run a risk and vulnerability assessment. And at the end of the week, I was handed a report that showed screens to systems that nobody should have been able to get to. And because of a misconfiguration here or improper network segmentation, they were a password away from getting to the Holy Grail. It changed my conception of what was possible and raised my level of respect for the sort of Americans that are working hard on election security here. Also important is to improve the communications throughout the election sector. So we've got all 50 states as members of the ISAC, but well over 2,200 local election officials are members as well. And we're just trying to build that, and we look for folks like you on here that aren't members to sign up. You can just Google elections ISAC, and that's the top link. But when you're back home, we'd appreciate you sort of evangelizing the value. I mean, it's important that everybody in our community is speaking the same language, is privy to the same bit of information. Also, you know, as you heard in a prior webcast, that, you know, being a member of an ISAC can provide you with significant support in the event of an incident. So one of our local engagement efforts is obviously through the ISAC, but also through the Last Mile Initiative. And you can see on the right, it's a sample of a poster that we've created for counties. It talks about, you know, elections in the specific state, in the specific county, lays out, you know, acknowledging some of the vulnerabilities, but, you know, goes deeper to talk about what election officials are doing to mitigate those vulnerabilities. In this way, it's showing deep partnership with available federal resources. Beyond that, though, it gets us all speaking the same language, so that sort of when reporters or press go and start talking at the local level, they're not getting necessarily 4 or 5 significantly different messages. But we're out, we'll be at any conference we're asked to go to. We've got a large field staff, cybersecurity advisors, protective security advisors that'll go out and come on site, but then we'll also come to every conference. We've got recommendations, catalogs, and slick sheets. Oh, just jumped a slide. So as we support the sector coordinating committee, so that's the collection of election vendors that are working hard to serve you guys better in this space, we've also developed some products with them. So you'll see this is from the Castle voting system. No, there's not a new vendor. We made it up so that we wouldn't be highlighting any one particular vendor. But the idea here is for vendors to also think through the things that they're doing to secure their infrastructure, but also making sure that election officials or third-party providers are doing the best they can to utilize things properly. I talked a bit about the campaign and political infrastructure. So we're willing to do our kind of big 3 services for them as well. So we'll scan all their public-facing websites, and I'll talk to you a bit about that more, let them know what vulnerabilities they are, whether they're critical, high, medium, low, provide that report on an ongoing basis. We'll also run phishing campaigns against their staff. And then we've got cyber awareness and incident response guides. And the goal here is to make sure that the ecosystem writ large is sort of more protected. So I think this is a good place to pause for any questions on our initiative, if we've got any. Is that right, Judd?
Yeah, so thanks for that intro. We don't have any written questions so far, but if you have any things, go ahead and submit it real quick. Hey, Noah, so just from my perspective, I'm curious, how does the integration of the information that's provided by the MS-ISAC, so you obviously, or MS or EI-ISAC, how does that work with the information that we get from DHS? How are those providing different information, different levels of security information to us, or are they complementary? How do I think of those 2 organizations and the information they provide?
Sure. Well, so the ISAC is a separate organization. It's run by the Center for Internet Security. It's got a governing board of election officials. They've got a number of products. You know, being outside of the federal bureaucracy, they've got the ability to sort of move a little quicker on providing some information, providing sort of analyst notes that don't need to go up sort of 6 layers of lawyers to get publications. So that I think they're a great resource in providing information, but we're all pulling from the same bit of information. So if you report things to the ISAC, an event or something, that will get inside of the greater information sharing network. So these are really complementary. You know, you're likely to get a broad notice from the federal government in the event of sort of something major. You saw the FBI alerts prior to 2016, whereas the ISAC is going to be a very strong sort of provider of information on a weekly basis. The MSISAC provides a higher level of technical information. So often that goes off to IT or off to vendors, but you know, you may find that 10 times a week you'll find particular versions of a software application or a part of the stack that's built in an application. Somebody's found a vulnerability and that a patch is up available. That kind of information is very important, as you know, one of the top goals would be for software systems to be updated and patched more regularly. You know, that's less kind of relevant in the regulatory environment when it comes to voting systems. But as you think about your public information systems, your public facing websites, your e-poll books, your voter registration systems, there's a lot more leeway to patch quickly. And that information is really invaluable.
Yeah, I think you just laid it out perfectly. I always kind of think of DHS as sort of the macro level. How can I protect my systems? How can I create the sort of protected infrastructure? And then EI-SCC is the momentary, hey, we've got this problem, you should really address it. Here's how you address it. So they're very complementary. I think that you explained it really well. Hey, we do have a couple questions. So Jay McFadden is asking about how can he get a planning snapshot for his locale?
A planning snapshot?
Yeah, earlier in your presentation, you sort of mentioned this idea of a planning snapshot.
Sure. Well, so one of the services we provide is a kind of cyber resiliency review. We can send out one of our protective advisors or our cybersecurity advisors, do 4 to 6 hour sit down with you and your IT staff, kind of discuss the current maturity level of the system, and they can lay out to you places that we've got resources on our website. Well, not public website, but once you're inside and engaged, where you can start to build out some response planning inside of there. So we're happy to send people out to conduct those sort of early conversations. There are also other public available information in that area. So the Belfer Center published a couple good guides, both on communications response, but then protection. The Center for Internet Security also has a good resource. So those are two places that I would quickly download and see if they can sort of backfill what you've already got going on.
Fantastic. And second question from Ashley Schweitzer. She's asking, are the services that you provide to the campaigns and to the parties, so those you sort of mentioned up front, are those available at all levels or just focused on the large state and federal races? Or maybe if I could rephrase it, how can Ashley reach out and get those services to be able to hand to her candidates so that they can help to protect their campaigns?
Yeah, right now the engagement level is at sort of high level candidates for federal office. So I'm not sure what level of government you are, but we certainly know some secretaries of state when candidates for Senate or House file that they're handing out information on cybersecurity, starting to prep them for the environment that they're running for office in, but also inform them of some of these direct available services. to my knowledge, as of now, those services haven't been pushed all the way down to kind of state or local level campaigns.
You know, just to add to that, Noah, here in Colorado, we've been working with our state DHS folks to develop some things for local candidates. So that's also happening, sort of an extension on what you said, in some states. So you might consult either with the state office, with Secretary of State's office in your state, or whatever the comparable office is, and or reach out directly to your state DHS and see if they have a program that they're developing or have already developed for local campaigns. I think that those were the 2 questions we had at this point. Why don't we go into part 2 of the presentation, and feel free to chime in with more questions as we go, and we will catch those at the end. Thanks, Noah.
All right, that's great. So look, I talked about 2 fronts: infrastructure and information. That's the ecosystem we're working in. Election officials have basically 100% control and responsibility to protect the infrastructure, and that's where a lot of the effort is, and that's protecting the virtue of truth. The hard part is we're in an information age where we don't have a lot of control. I oftentimes have to sit down with my own mother and say, "Mom, can you think about that email before you forward it or retweet it?" That's just the age we're in. There's self-reinforcement of ideas out there. There's plenty of places to go and find information that reinforces our thoughts. So you'll see a proliferation of sort of bad information. Keying on that, our adversaries are working hard to undermine trust in our institutions. And they can do that without changing a vote or disrupting a voter registration system, just by playing in the information area, or by hitting on one of our sort of highly networked devices like election web pages on election day, or with election night reporting. It's a really low cost attack that sort of doesn't affect the underlying truth, but can have a significant impact on trust. So election interference has been going on forever. There's sort of overt kind of interference. Think about advertisements in the Iowa newspapers about trade policy prior to 2018. Then there's covert action. If you read the Mueller report, Russians in Iowa as well, trying to determine our fault lines, shipping that information back to Moscow, and resources being deployed to work online to get inside of our networks, inside of our heads, and divide us. The goals are the same now as they've always been, new tools though. So with respect to election interference, the goal in the immediate short run is to affect the popularity of candidates or call into question the legitimacy of the process, to hope for a candidate that's more inclined to help their geopolitical goals. Those immediate goals are setting up midterm goals of sort of polarizing our political discourse, weakening confidence in our leaders, undermining our trust in institutions. And what that does is really forward long-term goals. When we don't trust our leaders or our institutions, we don't trust their decisions, that makes it easier for foreign adversaries to push their economic, ideological, or military interests. Picture something like NATO. The mutual defense sort of alliance has served the Western world well for a long time. It's a very tough bloc to go up against. Now, any one of the countries would be much easier to pick off one at a time, and if Western trust in an institution like NATO is diminished, it makes it easier to potentially pick off a single country at a time. So by reducing trust in leaders and institutions and decision making, it can play a longer term goal of furthering kind of foreign political or military interests. Also reduces confidence in democracy. And as I spoke about NATO, creates divisions in international alliances. So these things are set up pretty formulaically. Information operations are sort of like any other project. You set out a goal, and you go into research and positioning. What do you need to do to carry out a campaign? You go into production, build all the materials to do a successful campaign, emails, websites, social media posts, articles, and then you go into action. You publicize it and you amplify it, and you see if you can't get results with respect to Americans' understanding of the world that they live in. So I want to highlight one of these activities, talk a little bit about sort of what can happen to websites, and then reframe it for election officials. So usually when I'm in public, I would ask for a raise of hands of who heard about the big Louisiana chemical attack, and nobody did. And I'd say that's good because it didn't happen. Although the New Orleans, the Times-Picayune, CNN, New York Times all publicized it. Okay, and it was a pretty fascinating misinformation campaign. So on the research and logistics side, they pulled from public sources, cell phone and home phone numbers in the local area. They established social media accounts and bots, repurposed accounts that were in other places, built a full list of the media and key influencers in politics and on local boards. They went into production by building all the materials that would sell this. So fake surveillance camera footage of the chemical plant, doctored with explosions and real flames. YouTube videos showing ISIS claiming responsibility, Wikipedia page content, CNN pages that looked real. The URL was just sort of one-off, and then when it's put into social media, nobody can tell because they got those little mini URLs. And then they built the text message and social media campaign. So when they went into production, they text messaged the local residents with these video clips with the CNN page. The bots got in and started sort of promoting it with hashtags. It went viral locally, then got picked up by other mainstream news sources and finally national news sources. And so I think it's an interesting illustration of what's possible. I'm going to come back to it, but I want you to think about how that could play on election night. So we've been trying to build public awareness. I would bet if I asked you all to raise your hand or click yes, about half of you think that pineapples belongs on pizza. You'd be right. The other half of you think it doesn't. You'd be wrong. We took Pineapple Pizza as an example of a place where Americans are split about 50-50 to build a little information campaign that sort of shows how this is operated. So foreign adversaries will take a divisive issue, then they'll move existing social media accounts and bots, change a name, get them to like the campaign or dislike the campaign. Then those bots and sock puppets will start getting active and in the discourse and pushing us apart. It'll get amplified enough that the mainstream media picks it up. Okay, and then it gets blown out even further than that. So we set it out as a sort of kitschy way to describe what happens, but sure enough, fake accounts and bots got right involved really quickly into the debate. So it worked better than we ever could have thought. So some of the ideas about disinformation, this is a place where the American public has got the responsibility for, and campaigns have the responsibility for protecting democracy along this front. And they do so by educating their circle of friends, recognizing that this happens all the time and nonstop. Then it requires things like questioning the source of the information, doing a little more investigation on the issue before linking or passing it on. Let's talk a little bit now about ransomware. This is a growing threat. The business model is paying off for bad guys. It's a relatively easy one to execute through successful phishing or spear phishing campaigns. And it's something that sort of our agency is worried about looking out to 2020, not just with respect to voter registration systems or poll books or even potentially voting systems, but I think mostly about election night reporting or election day websites. So these things are really expensive. Baltimore and Atlanta both were hit. The ransom asked for some low single-digit $1,000. The advice is not to pay it because you then support the business model, but I think they're both upwards of $10 million each and trying to correct it. But you could also imagine similar phishing type attacks that allow bad guys to get control of your website. So on election night, picture instead of this team system DZ takedown, picture your election night results with the losing candidate actually winning, and think about the political environment which you work in. How many losing candidates aren't going to take advantage of that fact when they file their discovery or their election recount? We just live in an environment where that kind of attack, which gets at trust, not truth, is just as disruptive. So a brief bit on ransomware. I mean, it's software designed to deny access or take over access until the ransom's paid. So as we think about preparing for ransomware, we lean in on those same three services. So I think in my mind, most important of which is vulnerability scanning. So for 2 hours, 3 hours of your time signing up with you and your IT staff, you can get weekly reports that talk about the security of your public-facing websites. It's got a lot of value. There's intrinsic value in the report itself, which will tell you whether you've got immediate, critical, high vulnerabilities in your website. That's not static, though. You could leave your website alone, and the next week, based on research or exploits that DHS becomes aware of, all of a sudden, you've got new critical warnings. So it's a deep engagement that changes as we know more, as we get new intelligence. So there's intrinsic value. There's also value when you go and seek funding. And you go to your stakeholders. It's one thing to just go with an open hand, ask for money. It's another to go to your city, your county board, your state when you're asking for HAVA funds, or you're asking the federal government for more money, and you've got a report in your hand and you say, we've got these vulnerabilities in our website and we want to close them, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars. I mean, you're being good cybersecurity managers by doing that. You're not closing them, but you are advocating for the resources necessary to do that. I also think it's important that we spread the risk. Okay, none of us can do this alone. There's no way for 8,800 local election officials to build up the infrastructure necessary to perfectly protect against nation state adversaries. So we're all in this together, and it's important when we go to our funders and stakeholders to let them know sort of their role in defending elections, truth and trust, and sharing them detailed information on what vulnerabilities exist and how you can correct them is a very important way of doing that at the local level. Remote penetration testing is a lot like the risk and vulnerability assessment, that 6-day, 6-person engagement I talked about, but we can do it without coming on site and dig a little more deeply around your networks. It's a one-time engagement and give you significant reports that help build out an improvement plan so that you can look at investing wisely as a cybersecurity manager over the coming years. In Cook County, we were able to lay out a 5-year plan. We took it to our state board. We were able to get $600,000 or $700,000 in HAVA grants to start that pretty quickly. It's a quick way to jumpstart a maturity process and then show all your stakeholders how seriously you're taking it. But with respect to ransomware, my sense is the key is to back up your data regularly, keep it safely and securely off-site, but not just your data. I think you also need to build your source code because quite often you'll need to rebuild the system from scratch. And because time is of the essence when it comes to trust and truth and delivering the services voters expect, I think it's very important that you test this. You know, it's one thing to have data backup in your code. It's another to have to build a server, compile all the software, load the data, all of a sudden hook up all your endpoints. That's a very different thing that can take a lot of time if you haven't tested it. So to the extent possible, I would test your recovery plans when it comes to those data sets. All right, so I talked a bit about the vulnerability scanning. That's a very important one. If you send me an email, you just say you want that, I'll get that process started. Remote penetration testing as well. We've got a dedicated team that will look at the vulnerabilities, think about ways to eliminate those. Some of them will be easy lifts, others are going to be much harder, but allows you to decide as a risk manager what you're willing to accept now, what you're going to have to put off till later. And then the phishing campaign assessment. So we've worked with lots of jurisdictions, and in fact, we're working now with states who are leading statewide phishing campaigns. You know, they're collecting permission from their locals and helping run a campaign to help local election officials better protect the statewide registration list, for example, by becoming aware of the phishing campaigns. You know, a lot of them, even some of the state-led ones, trigger instant training on phishing. So you think about threat actors, nation states are powerful. They can, you know, if committed to a particular attack, generally carry them out. But 95% of what happens out there and the bad stuff that happened in Illinois is sort of routine commodity malware available on the internet that gets generally small jurisdictions simply because they don't have the resources to keep their patching up to date or their network appropriately segmented. They have a hard time sort of building in the defensive and the preventative controls. So defend, detect, recover. That's how I always talked about election officials, but prevent, detect, correct. You know, you want to make it hard for the bad guys to get through, especially since, you know, most of this is just like a bad guy walking through an apartment building, checking every door. Whichever one's open, they're going to get caught. So you want to do everything you can to make it harder. You want to at least lock the door, even if it's not the best lock. And then next year you can invest in the best lock. But you do that by regularly patching your software, by segmenting your network. I like to think of a network segmentation. So if your network is like your house, your house is locked, but once you get inside the house, the office is locked. And once you get inside the office, the file cabinet is locked. And inside the file cabinet is where your voting system is. You want to think about your network in that way and segment it off so that the bad guy gets in one place that they can't get to the other place. You know, blocking suspicious activity is helpful, and you can sort of, being a member of the ISAC can help you there. Governance is helpful. When it comes to detecting when things have, you know, logs are important, monitoring the logs, audits, these are all really important. And then corrective, between DHS, between the ISACs, the fusion centers, you have got partners that want to come in and help. All right, so I know we've got to get to some questions here pretty quick, but again, any of our services that you want, you can engage directly with any DHS rep that you know, but if you send me an email, I'll be happy to get you started.
So that was, this is Judd. That was the first question I had, is how do we get to these services? So it sounds like we can reach out to you, but we can also reach out to our state, or if we know some federal DHS officials. Is there other ways, or are those the two main?
Yeah, I mean, some states prefer to come through them. So if you search, just Google elections DHS services, the first link is our page. On there is a list of all the services, and the email, which is something like info@nkic.dhs.org. That's why I suggest to Google, and you just go in and request it there.
Fantastic. So we do have a couple of questions. Tanya Pruitt has asked, on this question of source, which is, I think, a great question and probably the future question, the one that we're going to need to address going forward. How can the public, and frankly us, discern from a fake that looks like it's coming from legitimate source, i.e. the example you cited with the Louisiana chemical attack? And then, you know, what do we do as elections officials to try to get better information to those people?
Sure. Okay, so I think the social media companies are trying to develop a way to build sort of curated news sharing. Also, when they're informed of things that are false, de-emphasizing them in the networks. So when it comes to things you know to be false with elections, each Secretary of State's office and state election director has a direct line into Facebook and Twitter. And so, you know, sharing that information up to the state will get over to Facebook and Twitter. And when it comes to the time, place, and manner of voting, if something's false, that'll be taken down pretty quickly. California put together an office just to do this and pull down 800 accounts or posts in the month leading up to the 2018 election. When it comes to false information about individuals, candidates, about what's going on in the world, there's not a lot to be done there. You know, Americans can get away with saying almost anything, almost all the time, falsely, and they do a tremendous job of it at sort of all levels, and we know that. If foreign actors do the same thing, you know, we have more leeway to do something. The hardest part is attribution. So it is the question of the time. How do we get to the bottom of this? And I don't have a great answer except to sort of have my personal answer, not the agency's, is a general skepticism for almost everything.
So, so just to add to that, people, Colorado does really well on voter registration, and I've had people ask, you know, how do you get there? And the way I describe it is you just got to build the wall. You got to do one brick in the wall. There's no answer. There's a whole series of answers. And so I guess what I would advise people to do is be active on social media. Get out there and be the voice that people hear and that they rely on. And then when people say things that are incorrect, you have an audience to convey that information to. Meet with your media, have them understand who the experts are, so that when they start peddling things that are incorrect, you can go to them and you have legitimacy with them, or they may even come to you first. So all of those are little bricks in the wall that will help you to convey better information and be out in front of it instead of responding.
Yeah, Judd, I think that's key. I mean, the burden on election officials is tremendous. But they also start from a significant position of power. At the local level, you are a trusted source. We're trusted more than state level officials, more than federal level officials. With that power comes sort of significant responsibility, and that responsibility is higher than it's ever been. To be transparent, now more than ever, to be the trusted source, to be sort of honest about, I think, vulnerabilities and mitigations and the risks you're sort of willing to take and to discuss it. I think to offer a little bit of nuance is very important, but I also think probably the key is to find those constituents or stakeholders who are most likely to be suspect or to sort of cause significant problems, and do your best to engage with them. Cook County is a pretty one-sided, partisan area. You know, I engaged with the Republicans constantly to make sure that they were trusting of the entire environment. And so when we did have an issue, to have you know, a group locally that was more likely to to have them as a third-party validator as opposed to somebody sort of throwing stones was huge, because it brings up confidence in the whole system. And so I think, you know, finding people who are most likely to be suspect and bringing them on as third-party validators is pretty invaluable.
All right, we have a couple of good questions lined up here. First, let me jump to Annie Williams' question. She is asking, has anyone developed a citizen awareness campaign or materials on this sort of misinformation, disinformation question, and what groups would be best suited to organize this type of campaign?
Well, so we did develop the pineapple pizza a product, which is sort of a way to describe it, and that information is available at the sort of elections DHS webpage. I do know that this being the question of the age, everybody is studying misinformation and disinformation, trying to find a way to combat it. I don't know if there's a particular good answer right now for your question that I'm privy to.
So one thing I can throw out is, I know West Virginia, Mac Warner, who's the secretary there, developed an outreach campaign that he went around the state providing to his voters. If you wanted to reach out to Secretary Warner's office, I know that they have distributed those materials widely. So that's one thing to do. There's a lot of other jurisdictions around the country that are developing these right now. You might check with your state office to see if they've got something brewing, and you know, just stay connected to IGO or your other organizations to see if there's something that can be done at an organizational level. Because this, as Noah said, this is the question. This is what we're all trying to figure out how to combat. Another question. So Leah Pfeiffer is asking, what's the role of state election officials in combating disinformation? So I think if you jump into this, it's something like, well, she kind of describes it as, one example is when you have an election night disinformation campaign stating that the polls are closing early, or, you know, there's exceedingly long lines. who can combat that? Is that solely the province of the Secretary of State's office, or maybe even the local election official? Or is that something that DHS or other federal partners can get engaged on?
So that, I mean, as the trusted source of information, the primary burden, I believe, falls with local and state officials. And so I think if you think about it in terms of standard of care for elections, the new standard of care sort of requires ensuring that the systems you utilize to deliver information are kept in shape. So your websites, your Twitter accounts, your Facebook accounts, multi-factor authentication, doing the basic blocking and tackling so that you can always push out good information, building relationships with the media, having sort of well thought out, well articulated, canned responses in the event of an emergency. However, when it comes to incidents, incident management, particularly like a cyber attack on infrastructure, will be an immediate partner. So will the ISAC. When it comes to misinformation and disinformation, it's a much more sort of nebulous space.
So Penny Limberg has a really great question. I think, frankly, a question that speaks to a lot of smaller departments. She's asking, what can a small department do? So these seem like recommendations that are designed for an entire jurisdiction. So a municipality, a county, maybe even a state. When you're a piece of a smaller jurisdiction, is something like penetration testing, this vulnerability testing, are those available to organizations like hers from DHS?
Yeah, I mean, so these services are available to election officials at all levels. Now, sort of being honest, it's important to suss out where the current maturity level is. We may find that a 6-person sort of good guy hacking job on an office that has 1 PC may be a little bit of an overkill. That said, though, everybody who's relying on web pages could get tremendous value from our sort of cyber hygiene or our vulnerability scanning. It's true that most election officials ride on infrastructure that the rest of the county rides on. So as an election office, you may very well have to pull in the municipal IT or the county IT. The good thing is that the value that runs to you as an election official also runs to the rest of that government level. The bad news is sort of that engagement is a little, there are more hands or more sign-offs that are necessary.
And then we have one more question. I'll note, though, that Erica Haas, who's one of the participants on the webinar, has given us a link to the War on Pineapple page. So if you go into the webinar chat string, you can see that link. So that'll be a way to kind of better understand that whole program that DHS set up to kind of demonstrate how this works. And by the way, pineapple on pizza is disgusting. So an anonymous request here is asking, hey, so how can we learn from or work with other jurisdictions outside the US? So specifically, there's a mention of Canada. Can we talk about the interactions that we're having with other democracies to help secure elections?
Sure. So the federal government is definitely engaged with our partners overseas, can often see what happens in other countries as to test ground for new tactics. Definitely sharing information with our most critical intelligence partners. We recognize this is a sort of global threat. We're sort of a big player, but we're just one puzzle piece. So we're definitely learning lessons in other places. And Canada put together, I thought, a pretty significant plan and released it recently, and certainly being being reviewed.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in my 2 cents on that. I've met with the Canadian officials on this question specifically once, and then on this question generally a second time, even traveled to Canada a couple times. And they're really interested in these topics. They have their own ideas, but they want to be engaged in the work that we're doing. So it's really a cross-democracy problem, especially in the disinformation area, that we're all very aware of. And you know, there's been a lot of talk of Ukraine in the popular press recently. Ukraine was really the first indication that we saw the Russian efforts back in 2014, I believe, was their election, maybe 15, where they were trying to inject themselves both from a disinformation, misinformation perspective, but also trying to get in and hack their election system. So they sort of previewed what they ended up doing in the United States in 2016, in Ukraine the year and a half before that. So we all really need to be working together on this whole idea. Okay, so, and the last question we have, hey, Noah, tell us about how you work with DHS. What's your consulting relationship with DHS?
So, you know, as a user of services in Cook County, who got a lot of value from it, who has sat in the chair that you guys all do, trying to run elections with limited resources, you know, I think I was able to bring a perspective that was unique to the agency. And I think my primary goal, as I define it, is to get out into the states and talk to the locals, and try to build bridges between local election officials, help establish trust between this sort of massive investment potential. You know, the Department of Homeland Security has as one of its top goals to support you guys. And I hope to be able to help build relationships where possible.
All right. Well, hey, thanks a lot, Noah. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to run through a couple of other things that I did the same thing that you've done. I'm just going to race through my own slides here. Let me try this. Aha. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our program. We have a certificate in elections administration at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute, and you can see there that it's a professional training program. It's to broaden your knowledge and deepen your skill set over a number of elections related areas. You can gain academic credit both at the undergraduate and graduate level, including credential credit. And it's fully online, it's very flexible, and it does not require travel. So it's a great option for those that want to sort of broaden their understanding and potentially even get an elections administration certificate. The classes are taught by prominent elections officials and national experts. If you're interested in our spring classes, there's a July 3rd, 2020 deadline to sign up for those. You can learn more by going to our link, which I'll show you here in a moment. Classes for the spring start on January 21st. Here are some of the courses that we offer in that program. You'll see at the bottom there, it's an election security and cybersecurity class, as well as some of the other things which are sort of basic classes of elections administration, including elections and law and election design, all of the kinds of things that can really help you to better sort of craft the way that you do your elections. Let me get to our last slide, which I can't seem to do. There we go. Whoops, now I've gone one too many. Gosh, this thing's tricky. Okay, and what's new? So you may be especially interested in the fact that we have an election security concentration that we're developing with an election security overview class, a specific class on physical security, and then a cybersecurity and elections class, which I'm going to teach in the spring. And then, of course, we will always have upcoming webinars. This is the third in the series on election security, but we've got other topics as well. I know Tammy Patrick's going to be teaching one upcoming, so look for that. There's information if you want to follow the link and find out more about the CEA program. And if you'd like to contact Leah or Lee to learn more or ask questions, you can. And there's my email address as well as Noah's. Hey, thanks a lot for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And feel free to connect with us if you have outside questions. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you soon.